Thank you for coming. My name is Jason Hofmann. I'm head of architecture for Limelight Networks, a content delivery network that hopefully at least some of you are familiar with in the room, and some customers I see and partners. So today we have an interesting panel, and we're going to cover a wide range of potential futures for delivery of content to end users with a focus on video. So we've all heard about the explosion of video online, the explosion of online video, the massive growth. We've been hearing about it for so long now that I'd say the trope has probably lost its impact, at least in words. But we still live the challenges that come from this video growing at a breakneck pace. There's no denying that the consumption of video on the internet is no longer the next big thing. It's just simply a thing. And our kids don't get TV time and video game time, and they just get screen time. I mean, what's more telling than that? Telling your kid they only get a half hour of screen time tonight, and they can use it for whatever they want as long as it's on a screen. And at least in my experience, kids I know, watching shows in bed on a tablet feels more natural to them than what the industry calls the living room experience or the 60-inch experience, which is the higher quality, more demanding, more challenging 1080p HDR, 4K, massive screen experience. Now, depending on where you sit in the industry, these trends could be exciting, could be concerning, or more likely than not, a combination of the two. Now, the industry is constantly looking for solutions to deal with these challenges in novel ways, with the aim to either reduce costs or increase revenues, or a combination of the two. Today, we have with us three panelists with decades of experience in the industry, bringing different perspectives to the conversation. To my left is Chris Allen, CEO and co-founder of Infrared 5. We have Rob Dillon, Digital Operations Manager at Tribune Media, and Dom Robinson, the Director and Creative Firestarter at Ideas and a contributing editor for StreamingMedia.com. A moderate, not too great round of applause, please. Save the great one for the end. Otherwise, it doesn't feel sincere. All right, I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Chris.
Yeah, so I'm Chris Allen, as Jason already mentioned. I'm a co-founder of Infrared 5. Most people know us for the Red 5 project. We were the first guys to reverse engineer RTMP and create an open source alternative to the Flash media server. Since then, fast forward to today, with the demise of Flash, we saw that as an opportunity and created the pro version of the product, which we're focusing now on WebRTC. And in particular, figuring out how to do extremely low latency or real-time latency streaming at huge scale. And we've been lucky enough to partner with groups like Limelight to create these kind of new next-generation experiences based on real-time streaming with huge scale.
I'm Rob Dillon. I'm the Digital Operations Manager for Tribune Media. Been in live streaming clear back in the days of radio back in the 90s. It's kind of a passion. I'm also kind of the odd man out on the panel, is that I'm not the scientist that these guys are, so I'm going to probably be pitching up the softballs for them to hit. So because I'm the content provider on this panel for all its sakes and purposes. So.
Just want to get one of my colleagues is shaking his head at me being a scientist.
Yeah, I was about to say I went to music school, so I don't know.
So hi, Don Robinson. I was up earlier, obviously. I've been playing with streaming tech since mid-90s. Like Robert, very passionate about internet radio and so on. I've got a long and potted history, but come early 2000, I started up a CDN over in the UK, which was predicated on driving IP multicast through the subscriber networks and so on. Slightly mad, crazy project. And then towards the end of 2009, I changed direction and went into providing software and technologies for people who are delivering workflows, and worked with colleagues in the audience and a couple of others to deliver a software stack which is essentially a microservices architecture of software where we can deliver very distributed workflows in a very dynamic and high scale and high availability fashion. So
Great.
that's the plan.
Thank you. So I guess I am the geekiest one here, huh? All right. So as I mentioned, Limelight Networks is a content delivery network. Though I'm not on the panel, and I'll try to keep some of my opinions to myself, we don't have CDN represented on the panel, so you may hear me interject a little bit there if JT doesn't drag me out of the room. But as a founding member and a board member of the Streaming Video Alliance, and as head of architecture for Limelight Networks, I hear very different concerns from content providers than I do from operators. And even amongst operators, do we have any operators in the room? Carriers, ISPs, operators, MVPDs? Okay. Even amongst operators, those with a wireless focus have a different set of challenges that they mention when they're talking to me as well in one of my two roles. In your opinion, and this is for whoever wants to answer it, what are operators looking for these architectures described in today's agenda, these next generation content delivery and video architectures? What are operators looking for out of those? What problems are they trying to solve, and what problems do they hope these technologies and architectures will solve for them?
Oh, you all looked at me. Okay. So, I mean, I think for the ISP and the subscriber and the layer 2 guys who've got tin in the ground, they want to keep their subscribers happy. That's the most important thing, and avoid churn. There's a competitive market out there for those guys. It's pretty commoditized. They need to keep their differentiators, and so if they're doing the same as the neighboring ISP, if they are in a competitive market, which perhaps there's differences from territory to territory, but if they're doing the same as their neighbor in terms of just providing access, but their Netflix subscribers or their Disney Online subscribers or whatever it may be are getting a worse service than the competing ISP, and they churn away, then that really is underlying the whole thing is really the most important aspect for operators and subscriber network owners. That would be my instinct.
And just probing on that for a second, would you say that view holds true in markets with more competition, like perhaps the UK, than maybe in rural US where the alternative to your ILEC is satellite?
Well, certainly if you open the can of worms that's net neutrality, then you get two...
I didn't do that. I think that was him, right?
But if one opens a can of worms that's net neutrality, they mean two different things to two different groups of people. And whenever I talk about it from a European perspective, net neutrality is about peering. It's about equal access to networks and so on in the sense of being able to use the networks. But over here, it's much more about the fact that you've got monopolies and you just don't have free choice and so on, and about creating more equivalence in the competitive end of the market. So for one, it's a monopolies argument. For the other one, it's more of a censorship or a right of use argument. So you've got different things going on there, I think. But obviously, if the ISPs can't offer USPs or can't at least play on an equal playing field to their neighbouring service providers because the content isn't delivered into their networks well, then that causes churn. That causes a loss of revenue, and that's expensive.
Right. So. Now, I certainly hear that concern from carriers. The biggest concern that I hear is wanting to reduce cost and pressure on their own backbone, and in the case of wireless, pressure on the links going to the cell towers. I hear a lot of cost arguments, but the quality one makes a lot of sense as well. And that's the primary one you've been hearing. Now, Rob, sorry, was there anything you guys wanted to add on that? No?
Just that if you're in a rural place like that and you don't have any choice, there's probably not as much of this churn argument, because what are you going to churn to?
Well, that's the monopolies,
Yeah.
I think, creating...
That's why I was fascinated hearing you discuss on the phone and then just then about over in Britain. Because here, most of the markets don't have a choice.
Yeah.
There's nothing to churn to. It's, then I think a lot of our carriers, for better or worse, are just more worried about their bottom line and their shareholders than actually providing innovation or disruption.
I'd also chip in, I'd be a bit of a heretic on on the network capacity issue. A lot of the last mile networks have an abundant capacity. And in fact, I did some research a long time ago. I did some writing for the magazine, and I noticed a pattern in 2002. There was a lot of transatlantic fibre laid and made available for dark fibre routes and so on. It's very cheap for operators to light a wavelength and open up a huge amount of capacity. So actually, this idea that's been pushed by CDNs for a long time, that the networks are under pressure, some of these inefficiencies are by the network operator's own choices, because it keeps a premium on the pricing of the network.
Controlling the market,
Yeah,
if you will.
it is.
Yeah.
No, I mean, the pressures that we hear, we see, meaning traffic being backhauled from one operator location to another before being delivered, and the carrier has a preference for it to be delivered out of point A as opposed to point B, they're visible and they're verifiable. Can speak to motivation, though, and that's an interesting perspective as to whether the problem is
There's an abundant
manufactured.
possibility to open up the peering. Whether the existing peering's under pressure is a different thing. It's
Right,
kind of layers, isn't it?
right. So, Rob, what are content providers looking for in the future?
Well, I'm different in the fact I'm a traditional broadcaster, or I work with traditional broadcasters right now. We aren't seeing a lot of revenue in the space, so we're wanting to keep our prices down. One of the things that come with that is, unlike our friends that do live sports, where you can predict a Super Bowl, you can at least have a pretty good prediction of how many people are going to be there. Unless you're in like a playoff game and it's tied at the last second in basketball or something, you're not going to see huge spikes. Well, I can go from 10 people watching a stream to 10,000 instantly. So do I pay constantly to be able to cover that 10,000, or can I spike up? Can I ramp up instantly, quickly, to where I can support that, but where I'm still not paying for those viewers that I don't have the rest of the month? Car chase breaks out in LA, all of a sudden everybody all over the country is watching my bandwidth, my pipe, my bill spikes. And I've had problems with previous CDNs because, again, we are very cost conscious that we don't deploy the multi-CDN systems, because I can't get that pushed through to my VPs and to our bean counters to allow us to do that for quality of experience. So I've had CDNs actually melt down in the middle of things. Best example was Boston bombing. All of a sudden, we had a few stations covering just the race, and then there was the bombing, and all of a sudden everybody in the country's coming to our stations to watch these in the local markets, and my CDN melted down, and I had to fire them on the spot and replace them over that weekend. If I was allowed to do multi-CDN, that wouldn't have happened, obviously. But so we're wanting to keep our costs down. Also, at the very head end, we're also getting to the point now where I've got engineers in my station saying, okay, there's no reason for me to have a $20,000 encoder when this vendor just sold me a $200 cube. That's not against Teradek. I meant a literal cube, not a cube from China, not a Teradek cube. Don't want to piss off John. And they said, well, this $200 box that I bought from China will do the same thing that $20,000 encoder you're making me pay for will do. So I'm having to explain to them how that introduces things like latency into the program, especially when TV engineers are the ones that will complain the hardest about latency, and if it doesn't match the broadcast signal, why does I have this half-second difference? Yet I can't get them to understand. We're so concentrated on bringing costs down as an industry, I can't get them to understand how come a $200 box is no better or is worse than a $20,000 dedicated appliance.
Right. So before we get to you to close out this question, Dom, what in your conversations with content providers, what have you been hearing? What are they looking for?
I think agility. I mean, we sell agility. Essentially, we try to deliver an environment which means people can change what they're doing and still rely on the service being available. So agility is really important. We're in an ever more adapting market, and if you can't keep up, you're going to be out of business very quickly. So, and they also want, to pick up on Rob's point, when you go from 1 to 10 to 10,000 to 10 million users and back down to 10,000 users, you want to avoid those fixed costs that are involved in keeping that availability there. So I think that's, CDNs were really the first clouds, and we look at the success of what's going on with AWS and so on. It's not about scaling up. Cloud is about scaling down when you're not using stuff. People get really obsessed with scaling up, and that's okay, that's important, but actually what you don't want is fixed costs, So So yeah, publishers I think are looking for that ability to be flexible and manage their cost bases and get that expenditure in line with their operating revenues. So their OPEX and operating revenues are in line with each other rather than risk all the time.
What else? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that ability to expand and contract like you're talking about is definitely something that we see a lot with a lot of very particular use cases, especially if it's event-driven. A lot of our customers are these kind of new trivia games, which include the live data feed with it, where they need to keep everything in sync. So they need to deploy something like our solution where they can get huge scale and latency, which we can talk about later. But the more important aspect of it is that they're able to scale that quickly and then shut it down. And a lot of them are using like AWS or Google Compute to deploy our architecture on top of. And it's mainly for that reason. Even though the cost per bandwidth is high during the event, it's like that flexibility of being able to shut it off is.
I mean,
pretty
I
important.
don't want to sort of harp on, but one of our flagship clients is what has been NASDAQ. West's just taken them over, but there's a lot of financial news broadcasting, and it's a quarterly cycle. They do 30, 40,000 live events a year, and where we went in and said, look, you've got these 4 data centers where you're aggregating all your satellite, you've got people like an old exchange patching feeds into encoders and so on. You've got to turn that all off. You've got to virtualize all of that. And once we actually did that virtualization, the saving they had in terms of not having to maintain these 4 broadcast centers because they just went away. They don't exist anymore. It's all moved into cloud environment.
Yeah.
When they scale their infrastructure down, it's tens of % of their what was their historic cost base has just gone away, and that makes a massive difference to them. I would conjecture it's certainly in the high millions, if not the tens of millions, annually to their operating base.
Yeah. I would even say that the, sorry, I got a spam call at the same time, so I lost my track. But yeah, that ability to scale up and scale down is probably the one thing that we see a lot of, and it's really important even for CDNs. And I think, like you said, they were the first kind of cloud networks, really,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of guys like Limelight and Akamai and all the others are looking at how do they become more flexible.
Yeah, so, I mean, right, so content delivery network edges are and have been sort of elastic from the beginning, like you say, the first clouds. But there are a lot of other components outside of what CDNs usually work with, like, you know, the broadcast centers and satellite downlink locations, and there's a lot of fixed costs still that are not elastic. And so that's an interesting topic. Encoders, in most workflows, are not elastic, although they can be made to be.
Yeah, I think encoders definitely can be, but I think the more you push that, the earlier you can get the network
Right.
into IP, the more flexible it is. So
Exactly.
if the field engineers originate in IP, you're laughing right the way through the network.
I think there's a huge opportunity for things like AI and predictive algorithms too, for things like news, like predicting when that spike's actually going to happen and then be able to adjust to it. Like, that's
Yeah, and
some
to
next
that, you know, we
generation
use all
stuff.
kinds of predictive tools to actually find, you know, the stories we're writing. And
Right.
if we can adapt that back to my needs and how much bandwidth I'm going to need and how much iron I'm going to need available at a given time that's coming down the pipe, it would be fantastic for our side of the world.
So Chris, you talked a little bit about real-time trivia games and real-time trivia apps. I have to say, since I got here earlier today, I've heard 3 different groups of people talk about that. So just a quick poll from the audience. How many people here are involved in, have a prospect, have a customer, know someone who has or is launching some sort of real-time app or is providing services to a real-time app? Is this a thing, or is this just, you know, a niche thing that people like to talk about? Anyone in here working with real-time trivia?
There's a few of them.
Okay, a couple of people. So what are some of the unique challenges for this sort of real-time interactive things like trivia, or real-time transactional things like
Auctions.
car auctions?
Yeah.
I'm from Europe, I can say betting.
Yeah, gambling, betting. You know, the big car auction in Arizona, something Johnson, Barrett, JT, Jackson, yeah. What are some of the unique needs that those content providers have?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is latency, right? And what we mean by that is from the video being shot to somebody seeing it on their phone or hearing the content.
So photon from lens to eye, basically.
Exactly, right? And that needs to be in relative synchronization with the data. And in the case of a trivia game, it's the questions popping up on the screen, right, as they say, where are the Great Pyramids? Are they A, in Egypt? You know, like that kind of thing popping up at the same time it's happening and people are able to tap and select it.
I want to know what game you're playing to get those easy questions.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll come up with a harder one for you later. Yeah, so I mean, that's probably it. I mean, it is the data synchronization. I know there are some groups that are just trying to solve that problem with just synchronizing the data, but we've kind of figured out by leveraging new protocols like WebRTC that you don't even need to really worry about that because we can keep the latency under half a second. And at that low latency, that kind of disconnect from the data doesn't really matter in these use cases, live auctions, betting, as you mentioned. But even some sports events too, it's really critical, like horse racing, for example. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are betting on that, but they want to, the show would even be over before, not the show, but the race would be over before a traditional like HLS stream would even begin, you know, and so those kind of use cases, you really need this sort of latency. And in order to do that, you really need to rethink the architecture of the whole network and how you do it. You can't just do caching at the edge because there's nothing to cache, you know, and you can't use HTTP-based protocols, and you know, things like UDP and WebRTC really become a huge benefit.
Right. And since we are talking about architectures, so I can get a little technical here, isn't it the case that some of the data you were talking about that's on screen, like the questions, WebRTC has a data channel too that you could
That's right.
leverage for some of those things to ensure they get there at the same time, if you wanted to?
Right. Unfortunately, the WebRTC spec does not ensure that the data channel and the video are in sync. So you actually have to do, if you really need perfect synchronization, we do have some customers kind of playing with this right now, like where they have like telemetry data going with the video camera. These are more like military type use cases.
So like if you have a time code on the screen, it can't be off by a quarter of a second.
Yeah, exactly. And so in those use cases, you almost have to do a ping back to the edge just to verify where it is and then kind of...
To figure out the channel latency. And
Right, and then set an offset on the video, even though it's milliseconds, you know, you're telling it to wait this much.
But your point is, I think earlier you said, if the latency on the video stream and on the data channel are both sub half a second,
then it doesn't even matter.
The perception is they're in sync.
That's
at
right.
all times.
Yeah.
I think transport stream, you know, transport stream time code is very usable. We provide a commentary system for a sports company, and we use a WebRTC loop to take the audio from an inbound feed out to a remote operator who's doing commentary through a web page, just on a simple app.
Right.
Bring it back again, and we do all of that loop right out to the remote operator in the time it takes you to do the compression of the main high-end mezzanine stream, and then use timecode to resynchronize it. And there's lots of data channels out there that can be used for resynchronization and so on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just saying it, like, the thought that if you send a piece of data over the data channel and the video channel is going, that those aren't guaranteed to be a perfect sync, that's all.
Yeah, the digital signage guys like that stuff.
Yeah.
So this next question is going to sound more like an oral exam than a question, because what are content delivery networks looking for out of next generation architectures?
Well,
I could probably take this one because
because we're working together.
Because I mean,
So
we
you know.
partner with Limelight, and they consider real-time streaming at scale an actual thing. I think others are looking at this. Like I said, other CDNs are kind of looking at how do you do the data synchronization as opposed to just trying to get the latency as low as possible. But I think these new use cases and new entertainment, like the live trivia things, I think that's just the beginning. I think the next, people have been talking about interactive TV for a long time, but I think it's actually come to fruition now, and we're going to start seeing way more interesting use cases. I wish I could tell you guys about all the cool stuff that some of our clients are doing that they haven't launched yet, but it will be coming, and it's very cool stuff that really engages the audience. So that was an easy one.
Yeah, it was.
Real time is one
for
of
you.
them. Yeah.
But, In your experience, both of you, what do you think CDNs are looking for? As people in this room and others go innovate, what do you think CDNs want?
Just from a high level, looking down on it, it's obviously you all have your own little niches and what you're going after, but you don't want to become commoditized. You want to keep innovating, keep providing people like me tools that I can use that are affordable. So you've got a double-edged sword there. You don't want to become a commodity, which certain players in your space have become. You want to keep innovating and helping me get to my goals, which is keep my costs down, but let me be able to scale and let me keep my quality of experience at the end user good.
Right.
So it's both ways.
I think I can be a bit cruel to some of the operators in the market here. I think we've seen the big boy move over into a strong focus on security. I'm not going to name him, but we all know who he is. So he's moved over for a big focus on security because you get margin on security. You don't get margin on shifting bandwidth, but you can't offer security unless you've got a global network presence. So you have to have a global network presence to play in the security space. But because of the commoditization, the margins have just diminished and diminished and diminished, meaning that you've got to add value-added services to differentiate and win the business, which has been great while the big boys changing their focus because it's allowed you guys to step in. Sorry, Jason, it's allowed you guys to step in because you've got a managed network, and I think that's critical. That allows you to dictate QoS rather than hope for QoS on a best effort principle. And I think that's a big differentiator. So I think the CDNs have been, on that level, have been hoping that things don't move away from HTTP because otherwise you've got to re-roll another architecture over the top of the network. But in preparation for the possibility that that might be disrupted by 5G, they're starting to explore virtualization and deploying new services like WebRTC for new capabilities deeper in the edge. So I think we're at a point of flux. I think we've got 18 months before the layer 2 and the telco layer sorts out what's actually going on in the edge networks. At that point, the market will reopen and get really quite busy for the CDNs.
I mean, I'm shifting roles now just a little bit because you hit on something very interesting, so I'm going to answer my own question slightly. But CDNs are in a really unusual position where, as you said, there's price compression year over year. And so we need to make our software and our edge denser and more efficient by a rate that exceeds the rate of price compression and traffic growth. At the same time, to compete and differentiate, you can either add lots of value-added services, and Limelight has. We have 11 terabit per second DDoS service. We have WAF. But you can also differentiate on quality. And so a big focus for us was insourcing our operating system development, our TCP stack development, and our network driver development, and moving everything as much as possible into the kernel to make things hyper efficient. Eliminating memory copies and things like that for the geeks in the room. So we've made our software more efficient. We've also cut rebuffers down by about a third, percentage of sessions affected by rebuffers. And so we've really been hyper focused on what everyone wants, better quality at a lower price. But it's exactly what you guys said. At least from Limelight's point of view, it's staying ahead of the quality curve because the quality leader is the last one to get commoditized, right? That's our view anyway. So,
I've also seen some of the work that we're doing with you guys. A lot of the focus has been on ease of use for the customer too, and doing things like being able to dynamically create streams on the fly, and giving them application architecture to be able to do that kind of stuff and kind of more deeply integrate the experience with things like data channels and everything else. So that's definitely a big move where it's not just delivering video, but it's creating a whole infrastructure for creating experiences which include video.
Yeah, and there's good reason for that because we at Limelight got burned 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago by giving customers all the tools they needed to build everything they wanted and giving our operations folks all the tools they needed to manage everything, but not having enough automation on either side. So the most sophisticated customers could go build whatever they wanted, but if, say, they were in your situation where they were budget hamstrung, it doesn't matter if we give you a Swiss Army knife that does everything you want it to do if it's going to take $50,000 to make it do what you want it to do. Of your own resources, that is, right?
Right.
And similarly, we need systems that auto-scale and auto-tune. In fact, there's a talk tomorrow that I'm on, a panel that I'm on, talking about how we use machine learning in creative ways to make operations life easier. So, I mean, I think that really resonates. I don't know how many people here in the audience think that hands-off keyboards is probably a good thing, right? Problems follow fingers. Someone once said to me. So it's unusual for things to just break in the absence of change. So the more automation, self-healing, learning you can put around your software, the better. So we've heard some themes, right? So flexibility, agility, auto scale up, we all know. Scale down is sort of a new one. I mean, you'd think they go hand in hand, but there was an element of scaling down to less than what you started with. Like, try to go IP as early as you can, so that you eliminate, that switchboard, and you eliminate needing to have, video equivalent of video switchboards that are taking Vivx feeds or satellite downlinks and encoding them and converting them to H.264, 265, whatever streams, HLS, RTMP, uplinks. So I think a lot of interesting themes. There's the automation around making it easier for customers to have turnkey experiences, so it feels like more of an out-of-the-box experience. So going back to challenges in sort of the operator, content provider, CDN ecosystem, in my experience, operators have been looking for on-premise solutions, primarily to reduce costs. This is, I know we debated that a little bit, but my experience, and also speaking to some of the vendors in the room that offer solutions, the primary driver for things like transparent caches and those sorts of things has been to reduce costs. Now, content providers and CDNs require the ability to add new features and services quickly, and we all need to retain control end-to-end over quality for the reasons we just talked about. Especially since the larger and more sophisticated content providers are selecting CDNs based on performance every 5 minutes or in real time. And sometimes they're laser targeted, like who's the best performing person on British Telecom on an Android tablet at this specific time of day. So the CDN selectors or CDN load balancers are getting very sophisticated. So are these goals, which I'll repeat, operators looking to drive down costs and deploying things on their premises, and CDNs and content providers wanting to maximize quality and retain control over end-to-end quality? Are these goals at odds with each other? Take your time. The hardest question of the day, by the way, and there's no right answer, I don't think.
I don't think so. The reason why is because everybody needs to lower the cost. It's not going to be profitable for a CDN to run if they can't do so. The businesses themselves who are delivering the video or have these video experiences, they need to control their costs too. And then, as we mentioned with the churn thing, maybe not so much in the rural US, but they also need to keep their customers from going away. So everybody's kind of going towards this. How do we optimize the system to make it better and cheaper?
That's pretty much what I was going to say. On paper, they are.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, it comes down to the person sitting at home on their tablet watching the video. Mm-hmm. And to do that, everybody needs to be working towards a common goal while still obviously understanding we're in for-profit industries and everybody, if we don't make money, we're all out of business. From me as a broadcaster to you as a CDN to the cable company, the MVPDs. So, we've all got to be working towards the end goal of the experience that the user has.
There was the Quilt presentation earlier. There was a good topic about the chasm between the sort of two ends of the value chain and so on. And I do think that there is a misalignment going on. Traditionally, your subscriber, effectively, the content would go from, particularly in the context of a live stream, would go from the head end down to the end user, and the money would go from the end user up to the head end, and the head end would then pay for the content. So there was it was quite a nice, simple business model. Mm-hmm. And now it's spaghetti out there. It just is spaghetti. And you have problems with ISPs starting to try to bundle content. Back in the UK, BT Vision's got a great vertical integration. They've done a great job at actually moving the fact that they are billing millions of subscribers, and now and not just for an ISP service, now they can start billing them for content with their BT Vision capability and so on and so forth. And parts of that are OTT, and it's not all on network. And that value chain alignment was working well for them. They've gone from a standing start in whenever it was, 2010, I can't remember exactly, but 2010, they've gone from a standing start to third largest subscriber operator in the UK for content. Right. And that they stand out as a really good working example, and I think that there are others are starting to follow. So I think that rights deal combined with the subscriber access and all the intermediary players, I think that still has some lining up to do. There's a disconnect. The CDNs have sat in the middle and bought bandwidth on one side and enabled content provider. They've charged everybody. And that's a two-way flow out from or a two-way flow into the CDN. It's not a passing from one side or the other to a value chain. And so I think over time the operators will become the CDNs. I think the traditional CDNs will look more like the super head ends in enabling, the Turners, the Disneys, whoever, to get the content out to the regional footprints. But actually, the operators will be the ones who are dealing with an infrastructure that's dealing with the tens or the hundreds of thousands of subscribers, not the CDNs. And the CDNs will be handing it off to a caching point within the operator network. And at that point, it allows the subscriber network to actually monetize that relationship they've got with the subscriber and the fact that they can go and leverage that with a content provider that much more. But there's rights deals to be done. It's complicated. Rights are still a very complicated minefield, and they're just having the opportunity to grow up because the landscape's starting to settle down a bit, I think.
Yeah, we've seen some conflicts with kind of user-generated content. Like a lot of groups are using our software, the Red 5 stuff, to build like kind of Periscope or Facebook Live equivalent style apps. And we've seen some of the data providers prevent you from streaming, up essentially and encoding video. And then in some cases, like in Vodafone in Australia, we've seen them actually blocking the protocols.
Yeah.
In other cases, like in Japan, they have like some of these deals where they've limited the data plan so much that they actually run out and then they can't ever even enable it afterwards. So I do think there is a disconnect there, especially from the mobile providers, of even making it possible for some of these experiences just because of their pricing plans. So.
I think a lot of the operators got it wrong with IPTV in the late 2000s. I think they weren't ready. The technology wasn't ready, and I think that technology's matured a lot now. I think, at the end of the day, people do talk about these inefficiencies. My CDN, which I ran a decade ago, was all about driving IP multicast adoption. It's absolutely brilliant at scaling live content. But trying to explain to ISPs it's going to make them more efficient, I ended up coming to the conclusion that ISPs didn't mind the inefficiency because it was making them money. They'd rather charge 10,000, 200,000 unicasts and make that money than sit down and go, well, actually, this is quite efficient. We could actually give something to our customers and charge 100,000 subscribers for something.
So I'm not convinced that the future is going to look like a hub and spoke with the CDNs as the hub and the caches deep within networks as the spoke, because I think that there's a lot of hurdles between where we are now and that. One, you need context to be able to understand which parts of the URL affect cacheability, which ones don't, how to process the tokenized URLs, process cookies, decrypt SSL. It's not impossible, but there's a lot of challenges, and that's why I think a lot of caches within networks focus on the low-hanging fruit, like the unencrypted iOS updates and things like that, where they can get 99% cache hit ratio, get a big bang for their buck, chop off the top third of the spike, and call it a day. The other reason I think it's an uphill battle, I'm not saying it's impossible, is that at the level of architecture and whiteboard diagrams, people talk about deploying deep into carrier networks. But the deeper you go, the less traffic you're exposed to, but you're not exposed to that much less content or library. So as a CDN architect, I can tell you what that results in. That results in crappy cache hit ratios. You take a few steps back, and from the 50,000 sub range to the 500,000 sub range or the million sub range, and all of a sudden you have a business. And that's why I see, in a lot of cases, gear being deployed at the boundary between the carrier's edge and core, where they're not using a macro lens to focus on, Levittown, New York, but they're looking at Long Island as a whole, for example, since we're here in New York. And then that's when you get a good balance of the cost of the hardware, the amount of disk space you need to allocate, you get some good cache-hit ratios. So that begs the question, what's the difference between being there, on that side of the river, or here at the CDN edge? What's the difference between the CDN edge and the carrier's edge core boundary when they might just be a couple of milliseconds away from each other? So devil's advocate question, what is going to push, as you say, what is going to push the carriers, what is going to push the industry to using the carriers as the tip of the spear as opposed to using CDNs as the tip of the spear? What's going to be the tipping point? The tipping point for the tip of the spear. And mixed metaphors, I apologize.
I mean, you've got to touch on machine learning, you've got to touch on architecture there. At the end of the day, if the architecture is kind of an inside-out cloud where you can run any microservice, any application anywhere, the network itself will decide where it's best to put that cache. You won't have to deterministically define the boundary. So when you look at forthcoming technologies like MEC, like right down in the radio networks, it should be such that the microservice determines that, right, actually we only have 2 users who want this particular nuance of bit rate of stream, so we'll run the encoder in the RAN. And we'll just split the stream straight out of the front of that encoder. Oh, now we've got a third one who's further upstream. So actually if we move the encoding process on the fly, upstream into the core, onto the peering point, wherever it may be, the network will move services around on the fly. It's not pre-provisioning, it's not 3-minute planning. It's between a GOT. That's how fast services should be mobile. That's certainly how we approach it. And we would move services around as the service is dynamically changing, or the requirements of the service is dynamically changing. So I think drawing rings is useful for getting budgets in companies, but actually I think that really the architecture should be flat and should be flexible, and the network itself, the network itself and the use of the network should be completely dynamic at every level. So that would be certainly looking forward, that would be how I think networks should architect.
I could add to this going in that direction. I would say that there's some compelling arguments that you can do a lot of this on peer-to-peer architecture too. We saw the session before this one from these guys at Strive CDN. There's like Peer 5 and StreamRoot that are kind of taking the approach of why not use the client bandwidth and redistribute the videos in that sense too. So that's actually taking it to another level, where obviously you still need some kind of delivery mechanism in the middle to be able to get it there, but after that point, you could start leveraging peer-to-peer networks on clients themselves in unique ways. So I think there's a lot of innovation all over the place with this. And that's what makes it exciting. The future is uncertain.
There are some cause and accountability issues with peer-to-peer.
Okay, I'm not saying there's not problems with it. I just
it's
interesting.
But I totally agree with that. I mean, in terms of drilling a multicast into an enterprise or something like that, AMT, which we were producing in 2006, sort of just before Octoshape and those technologies came out, that kind of automatic multicast tunneling, AMT, I think is an architectural necessity, but we always call those application layer multicast. They live in layer 4. Whereas really what you want to be doing is kicking the routing engineers to properly put multicast in at layer 2 and 3. Read the books. It's not that difficult. It's a dark art, but it's much cheaper than putting out new kit everywhere. The capability for multicast is out there specifically for live streaming. It's a decision in the ISPs not to turn it on.
There's a working group in the Streaming Video Alliance called Transports and Networks, I believe. And one of the things that's still being talked about decades later is multicast. And can we build something? And like many other discussions we have, it comes down to collaboration between different stakeholders and standards. And so, on that note, this was going to be a question, but I'm just going to state it as an assumption. I agree with the premise that if we had a video OTT and a CDN platform and a video delivery architecture that was open and flexible, we could, it's a layup, right? We could meet the needs of all the players, operators, CDNs, and content providers. Of course, we could design something that meets the needs. The question is, which was supposed to be a follow-up, but we're running low on time, do you think CDNs and operators will work more closely together in the future? For example, to determine what CDNs should be offloading at what times of day, to have more visibility into the topology of the deep deployments or deeper deployments. Do you believe some of this collaboration we're talking about, whether in the context of multicast relays, whether in the context of deep caches, quilt caches, whatever, do you believe that this closer cooperation will happen?
So I think the operators will certainly collaborate with the CDNs because I think they're in a learning mode. I think for a long time they didn't want to know about anything in layer 4. Now it was really nice that the CDNs would run the media servers because the media servers were a bit weird and we didn't really get those. Someone else can run those.
Can you say that again while I record it?
And then gradually they became HTTP servers, which is a bit more familiar and actually everything focused on it. So now actually maybe we could run those in-house and then we could do some transparent caching and that's kind of a bit more commoditized. And actually we'll start running that in-house. And so the operators have crept up the stack a little bit. And I think they're still doing that learning.
But
very
still in
much.
learning mode.
But the question is, once they've learned, that's where I'd be worried about being a traditional pure play or overlay CDN.
Well, I think that's where new protocols come in and new techniques which are beyond the simple HTTP delivery.
Yeah.
You mean like
that start-
HTTPS? Good luck caching this?
Yeah, that or WebRTC, which is using SRTP for delivery, and it's got the whole ICE, negotiation piece. It gets very complex very quickly.
We still talk about big live streams being 5 million users, 10 million users. I don't know what your big live streams are, Jason, but a big live stream is that sort of scale. Really big live stream is newsworthy, but that's kind of not even on the ad ratings for broadcast.
Right.
And we want our industry to move into that space. And we're hitting limits, I think, particularly with HTTP. I think we hit limits and TCP-based protocols. We didn't have 20 years ago, 15 years ago with RTP.
Just because the scale
RTMP.
wasn't there, right?
Well, session-based protocols.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time, the engineers in the world spent a lot of time sorting out flow control, sorting out all the issues with session-based protocols so they could really scale and get real efficiency. And then it became cheap to do HTTP.
Yeah, so I was just entering the CDN industry around that time when session-based protocols like RTMP Live coexisted with projects like what became Silverlight Smooth Streaming and Adobe Project Zeri, which became Adobe HDS, and Apple HLS, I forget the code name for that. But we were involved in all of those, and what was really interesting, and the very, very first one was Microsoft Smooth Streaming. What was really interesting was one of the big things that drove that was for these massive events, they could recruit 12 CDNs instead of 1 or 2, because everyone could do HTTP. But there's nothing inherently wrong with a relay-based, stateful, session-based, non-HTTP-based streaming solution. What tipped the industry over the edge, in my opinion, back around 2007, 8, 9, into 10, was the fact that there were more CDNs, namely all of them, that could do HTTP chunked streaming than there were those that could do RTMP live at scale, or that could do RTSP live at scale. It was just more.
Well, it also didn't hurt that Steve Jobs did his statement on Flash, and then everybody else kind of bailed on it, and iPhone didn't support it, and everything else. So.
I think while we're reminiscing on that era, and I think there's some important reflection to be taken from that point. I think a couple of things happened. Windows Media, and please, if there's anyone from Microsoft in the room, please shut your ears. Microsoft did something really good, and I won't say that very often, but Microsoft did something really good, which was Windows Media. It was an extremely flexible, good platform, and still to this day, for NASDAQ, or West as they've become, we just still deliver a large amount of Windows Media into relays that are in enterprises because it's simple to multicast and scale up for those town hall meetings, scale up for those things. Of course, Flash came along, which started adverts faster, and that suddenly gave the industry a revenue model, even though Adobe didn't support any multicasting for another 2-3 years. Right. And that was a real moment in the industry, which then took everything into TCP, and at that point, everything Jason says happened with the commoditization onto HTTP. And there was a missed trick there. I think we've missed something. I think we do. I think we are going to struggle to get into the proper hyperscale tens of millions, hundreds of millions, the World Cup final being IP delivered, which is also a shame for the rights guys, because if you deliver stuff in IP only, you don't have a piracy problem.
Right.
Pirate content is always traditional book content rebroadcast on IP. IP content is quite easy to protect if you never transmit it in a traditional clear format. So anyway, I'm reflecting and reminiscing.
So one of the alternatives that I've heard to carriers going at it alone is offering a nice little incubator for CDNs to put their software on. Could be vendor supplied, could be their own, could offer some of the buzzword-enabled stuff that we see in the agenda for today. I mean, it could be auto-scaling containers with Kubernetes. It could be, it could include network function virtualization. It could include elements of software-defined networking. But it could offer CDNs a way to deploy their existing caching technology within the carrier networks, giving everyone what they're looking for, potentially. The control over end-to-end quality, the control over end-to-end content management and ability to purge instantly and whatever else we need, while also providing the cost offload and the network traffic control, the pinpoint traffic control that the carriers are looking for. Do you think that that kind of approach would come to fruition faster than the alternative that was described, which is the carriers continue down their learning mode path and then go into their seek and destroy mode? What do you think is more likely to happen, or what would you like to see happen? More cooperation, or competition, more friendly?
So I think
deploy your stuff in my network.
I think I'm thinking of Telstra. They've really kind of gone for it a little bit, actually. And I think the Telstra guys have gone for a very virtualized environment. And I think they've got their eyes on Amazon. I think the CDNs are kind of an incidental application on the way there. They want to be able to offer anyone the ability to run any type of application across their network. If you've got a specific type of service that needs a multi-point presence, multi-pot, multi-mast, whatever it is, application, they want to be able to sell you that capability, and they want to be able to do it on a per-second billing model. I think that's the nirvana
Operators.
for operators.
So I see
Take
that.
the cloud and turn
Right.
it inside out.
Well, the reason CDNs the size of Limelight can't run edge nodes within Amazon is not that they don't have the services to allow it. They do. And it's not just the cost, although that's an issue, because at the prices they would charge us, we wouldn't make any money. The biggest thing is the diversity of connectivity to end users that they don't have. Coming out of an EC2, you're not going to get the kind of connectivity that we have, or even that CloudFront has. Sometimes it's a different caliber of connectivity. But if carriers were to offer the ability to deploy containers, the ability to do software-based load balancing, that would be very interesting to CDNs, for sure.
And it's a very traditional layer 2 type of model, because it's tin and wire.
So last question, which came from one of you guys who shall remain anonymous. How does the regulatory environment affect innovation in the space?
Yeah, well, this was
I
on
think
our
that was a yes.
I think this was on a pre.
But it wasn't a yes/no question, no.
But I think latency is motivated in different ways. You know, in the UK, we have a lot of interest in latency because there's a big online betting market, and that's got a regulatory pressure over here, and yet the amount of investment available for innovation in our sector is largely this side of the Atlantic, and I think those kind of regulatory issues are creating odd dynamics in the market and so on. I think. You know, there are a number of regulatory pressures, not only that might have a direct or indirect effect on things like latency, but we see in the audio space, the audio rights market is still moving. I've gone blank on the name of it. There was a regulation that went through Congress a couple of weeks ago to readdress all the royalty structure in the US and so on. And I think that those frameworks are starting to catch up a little bit and will create better innovation for the content delivery market. We often forget those. I I think the amount of times I get asked to launch expat services, can we deliver BBC One to the British community in Spain? And you have to explain quite a long time to people that BBC One is the rights deal done in the UK for that content. It's territorially bound to the UK. That's what a channel is. But the regulatory world needs to catch up a little bit to enable this market to grow. And I think we're probably prone to see some changes over the next couple of years now.
So I just looked it up. Are you talking about the Music Modernization Act?
That's the one, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We have like 2 minutes left, 3 minutes. Let's open it up for questions. I think we have time for one or two. Don't be shy.
It's an after lunch session, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the after lunch session.
I've got a question for you. Are you awake?
I guess it was too broad of a question.
Too broad of a question. Well, I asked the targeted ones, and I got like 2 hands per question, so I don't think going targeted works either. I don't know. Who wishes that the
This
happy
guy's
hour
got-
started now?
We've got a hand over there.
Oh, yes.
Oh, he was answering the happy hour.
Let me clarify. So Dom said that he had a pessimistic view for CDNs of the eventual future where CDNs would act as feeders, like big regional distribution centers in, say, Amazon's home delivery model. We would act as feeders where we would, as a CDN, supply the largest carriers, like, say, Verizon, Comcast, BT, Sky, plus all the other small guys that don't have their own CDNs. So we would do the smallest subs as well as feed the in-house CDNs of the largest carriers. And I hand-waved over that and just called it hub and spoke, as in, by and large, we would be a hub. And we would distribute mostly not to end users, but to other CDNs owned and deployed within carrier networks. And so my point was, I don't see it going that way. I certainly hope for CDNs it doesn't go that way. But that's what I meant by hub and spoke, just shorthand for what Dom was describing.
Something like the super head-end and head-end model of the old cable networks.
And there have been cases where we've done that. When we work with CDNs in China, for example, that we partner with, a lot of times it's much more performant for them to fetch the content from us in Hong Kong, for example, than it is to try to fetch it directly from the content provider's data center in Dulles, Virginia. So we've played that role. Years ago, there was a CDN that ran out of capacity, we shall remain nameless, and they partnered with us. And we provided terabits of capacity to them, and they handed us traffic. So they acted in that role for a little while. But I'd have to say it's the exception, not the rule. And I don't see the market going that way, but who knows? I've been more often wrong than right, so. All right. Thank you very much.